So if we could all be seated, we're going to go ahead and get started. There's a few more people coming, but we're just going to let them sort of straggle in as they find their parking and arrive.
Just waiting for a quorum. I think we're short. I think we're down one. Oh, Jerry
Okay.
Hill's still rounding up some votes. Welcome. Good morning. Yeah. So, welcome to Sunnyvale. For those of you from out of town, I'm one of the local poobahs. Our major poobah, the mayor, is off on an important mission for mankind, and I've been called in to introduce. Normally, vice mayors are used for comic relief. I fully understand that. However, we do have 4 guests from Sacramento this morning, so in the comic relief area, I'm not going to attempt to compete. Welcome them. Before introducing our guests, just a word on behalf of Sunnyvale. So when you all drove in this morning, actually let me check. So who biked in this morning? Walked in, okay. Public transit. Okay, horse. Okay, so clearly this supports the theory that we need more horse paths. But anyway, when you came in and drove in this morning, you may have noticed that when you crossed over that border into Sunnyvale, there were fewer potholes, less graffiti. The public medians were well tended, unless they were county expressways. So you may have noticed a little difference, and I wanted to just ask you to think a little bit about that difference, not just in the context of city planning, but also in terms of the state, and ask why is Sunnyvale just a little bit different? Some people have the theory that we're lucky, and that's a good theory. We have employers here, we're prosperous, good jobs, and so we're lucky. But there's another view that actually the long-term financial planning makes a difference. And in Sunnyvale, we have a 20-year financial planning horizon. And I think that in the times today, the voters appreciate that, folks appreciate that, and I think that actually the argument is kind of already over on the subject of fiscal conservatism and long-term planning, and now it's just a question of who can present themselves as the better fiscal conservative. So with that in mind, I'd like to introduce our guests and welcome them. We have this morning, and I had long biographical blurbs that I was going to go into in great detail on each guest because they have a distinguished histories, but I've been guided to turn off the hot air and just briefly introduce them and get out of the way. So I introduce our state senator, Joe Simitian. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Our assembly member, Paul Fong. Welcome. Assembly member Richard Gordon. And Assembly member Jerry Hill. Welcome.
Morning.
Our moderator this morning will be our distinguished CEO of our local Sunnyvale Chamber of Commerce, Don Eagleston, and I will now turn it over to him. Thank you, Don.
Well, thank you very much, Dave. And I wanted to thank the city of Sunnyvale for partnering with us on this. It was very helpful. We have Councilmember Jim Davis with us, and you just met Councilmember and Vice Mayor Dave Whittam. Gary Lubers is with us today, our city manager, and I want to give a special thanks to Connie Versailles, the economic development manager, who helped make this all possible in partnering with the city today too. So thank you very much to the city of Sunnyvale. We are going to have a series of questions. I'm going to be proposing questions in several different topics this morning, and everyone will have a chance to respond here. We have blue cards in the back for questions, and Connie will be picking up those blue cards. Those questions will be screened so we don't have any repetitive questions or questions that we feel may not deal with the economic development and the business issues that we're trying to address today. Those cards will then come up, and I will feed those questions to the legislators at that point, and they will answer the audience questions that way. Also, before we start, I really would like to thank several of the chambers of commerce, because we had 13 chambers of commerce help us with this event. And I wanted to thank, and I'm just going to sort of read them off, the Black Chamber of Commerce of Silicon Valley, Campbell Chamber of Commerce, the Cupertino Chamber of Commerce, the Gilroy Chamber of Commerce, Hispanic Chamber of Commerce of Silicon Valley, Los Altos Chamber of Commerce, Los Gatos Chamber of Commerce, Milpitas Chamber of Commerce, Mountain View Chamber of Commerce, Palo Alto Chamber of Commerce, Santa Clara Chamber of Commerce, Saratoga Chamber of Commerce, and of course the Sunnyvale Chamber of Commerce. So I want to thank you all for working on this event with us and inviting your members to attend. So we're going to go ahead and get started here. And the first thing, like you saw on the flyer, we wanted to talk a little bit about Governor Brown's sales tax initiative and its impact. So Governor Brown's tax initiative has recently taken a new twist by lowering the proposed sales tax increase and raising the tax on income over $250,000. My question to the panel is, what exactly is the governor's new tax proposal at this point? And what is your level of confidence that if passed, the revenues will reduce tuition costs and provide a more affordable access to post-secondary education? You want to start, Joe?
Sure. How did I get so lucky? You get the tax question, Joe. That's good. This has been a little bit of a moving target. The governor, as I think many of you know, originally proposed what was essentially a bump to the upper income tax bracket, the state income tax bracket, along with a half-cent sales tax increase. And there were folks who, he had his supporters and detractors on the initial proposal. There were some folks who liked it because they sort of thought it was we're all in this together kind of a proposal. Yes, some income tax hit on upper income brackets, hopefully folks that could afford it, but hey, we're all in it together. We're going to have a sales tax increase of about half a cent that everybody would have to pay. That was the sort of positive view. The negative view, the detractors said, we think it relies too heavily on the half-cent sales tax, which is characterized as regressive, and we're not so sure we like that. So meanwhile, the California Federation of Teachers, CFT, said, we've got our own proposal, which is geared towards the income tax exclusively and upper income brackets that would have had a bigger hit on those folks. And their argument was that it was less regressive because it did not involve the sales tax, and that it was geared more towards folks at the upper income brackets who could, in their view, afford the hit more easily. There were some folks who had sort of pure policy differences about that. There were other folks who were simply political in their analysis of that. The CFT argument was, our measure will be more popular than the governor's measure, and this will surprise you. The reason they said it would be more popular than the governor's measure is because there are fewer rich people, and if we only tax them, then everybody else will like our measure. And from a political standpoint, that was absolutely a correct analysis. The surveys and the voting results over the years show pretty clearly that people are willing to support taxes as long as they're on somebody else. So that debate ensued, and the governor was very anxious about all that because he felt strongly that there ought to be one measure on the ballot so people could be clear about what the debate was. Here's what we'll get, here's what it will cost, make the case. Ultimately, he was able to persuade the CFT folks to withdraw their measure, compromise with him on the measure that he's now put forward on the ballot, which relies a little more heavily than he originally did on those upper income tax bracket income tax hits, and with a smaller sales tax increase, 1/4 cent rather than a half cent. The matter is still quite complicated because there's a very wealthy attorney, a woman named Molly Munger, who has her own measure that she is still pursuing, and it is entirely income tax based, and it goes lower in terms of the brackets and would include more people. And her argument is that it is a better plan for California public education, and that is her focus. She's focused on that. And then meanwhile, just to make it a little more complicated, there's a third plan out there from a fellow named Tom Steyer who wants to deal with readjustment of the single sales formula. And if you don't know, you don't want to know, trust me on this. The single sales formula tax that applies to out-of-state businesses, and he wants to take that tax break away from them and then reinvest the money in other ways. A lot to grapple with, and that's why the governor is, I think, anxious that that's too much for people to keep track of, and he's trying to get people to focus on his measure. His measure, in terms of the confidence level, I have to tell you, none of us should think it is a cure-all, because it is not. If the governor's tax measure passes, it will largely be a stabilizing measure rather than a dramatic improvement in what you see going forward. So the real issue is what happens if it doesn't pass, and the answer is that the budget that we will all be crafting for June the 15th will contain what are known as trigger cuts, and if the if the tax proposal doesn't pass in November, then those trigger cuts will take effect with pretty dramatic impact. So why don't I stop there so that other members can get a word in edgewise if they'd like to on an area where there's plenty to talk about.
So that is a concern, is like I said, what is our level of confidence that this will actually stabilize the state? And if not passed, if this initiative is not passed, what are the consequences and functionality of our state? And where will the possible budget cuts do the most damage? Do you want to comment on that, Jerry?
Sure. Thank you, Don, and thank you to the chamber for this. It's certainly a Chamber of Commerce day in Sunnyvale. Just walk outside; it's beautiful and gorgeous.
It's always like this.
I know it is. That's absolutely true. But thank you for the invitation and for allowing us to be here. And Joe did a great job of explaining the different tax proposals. And the one issue that is distinctive and a little different with the governor's proposal is that at the end of the day, if it were to pass with the budget proposal that the governor had earlier in the year, the budget would be pretty much balanced. It would not have caused a greater hit on the balance or on the deficit that would have to be balanced. On the Munger proposal, because of the manner in which the money would come into the state and into the general fund, it would cause a couple of $1 billion additional of cuts that would be necessary, and that still holds today. But the problem is, as Joe mentioned, and rightly so, is with the economy not improving as it had anticipated to be, with the governor's early budget and with the tax increase of about $6 billion, we would still be a few $1 billion short. But with the proposal that, and the controller's statements of earlier this week, and with the savings that haven't been realized from last year's budget, we're looking at probably a $5 billion increase of deficits as we move forward. That would be on top of what was proposed for this year. So it could be into the double digits is the challenge that we're faced with. And as the governor has clearly stated, the trigger cuts that he will place in the budget will be specifically directed towards education. And that's something that I know we're all fighting against and working hard to prevent. So that the challenges that I've been faced with, I've been in the legislature for 3.5 years now, and we've cut over $46 billion from the budget. And a large portion of that has been from K through 12 and certainly higher education as well. And we really have to stop that bleeding, and that's why I think the governor's proposal is something that can help us in that direction.
Great. The other concern is, of course, if this does not pass and where this possible budget cuts are going to be doing the most damage to the people of California. I know we have a lot of people here today from the education system, and I think that's a very big concern of where their money's coming from and can they have a sustainable, predictable budget every year. Rich, could you comment a little bit on your take on the governor's tax proposal and what are some of the possible consequences if this does not pass?
Sure, thank you very much. And Don, let me thank you and all of the chambers for putting this together. And I want to take just a quick second of personal prerogative and thank Joe Simitian.
Take all the time you like, Rich. I don't know what it's about, but I'm for that. Thank you.
Joe always has an ability to provide us with great information and to pull together facts and information. And he has served us and this region well in the state legislature. And I, for one, will miss him when he is no longer serving us in that capacity. So, Joe, thank you.
Thank you very much. It's very kind.
For those of you who do not follow the intricacies of how we do a state budget, it's a kind of an evolutionary process in many ways. We start in January with the governor putting out an initial budget, and we have conversations about that, but we don't really get down to the serious work until what's called the May revision. And this coming Monday, the governor will put out a May revision. When he presented a budget to the legislature in January, he suggested that he thought we would have about a $9 billion gap to figure out. And he was proposing part of that through cuts and part of that through his tax measure. The budget that will come out on Monday, the revision, will have a gap much bigger than the $9 billion because our revenues have not come in at the level that were originally projected. There were a lot of rumors yesterday in Sacramento about how big that hole will be. Some say that probably at a minimum 12 billion, and maybe up to 15 billion, somewhere in that range. I was in a meeting yesterday afternoon with the governor, and he was asked directly, how big is it? And he said, it's a surprise until Monday. So I don't know exactly what that deficit will look like. We won't be able to make up all of that deficit with a tax measure passing in November. So we'll still have to make some cuts, and we'll have to take a look at preparing for additional cuts, these trigger cuts, should a tax measure not pass in November. Specifically as it relates to education, from my perspective, and I think and my colleagues on the dais here would share that, we have devastated education already in California. We have taken our K-12 system and I think cut it to the bone. And when you think about cutting any further, I think the only thing left to do is to shorten the school year. It simply goes in the absolute wrong direction. We've also done some very bad things to our state universities and our state colleges with the cuts that have been made there. And I think that the governor's budget on Monday, you will see additional cuts to education and additional cuts to higher education. And I think we'll all struggle with that because those are not cuts that any of us want to make. The most important investment we can make in California for our future is in education. And that's where our first dollars ought to go. And we're not doing that at the moment, and I'm concerned that we won't immediately get there as we struggle to get out of this recession. I'm going to defer some additional comments on particularly education and higher education to my colleague Paul Fong, who has some real expertise in that area.
Go ahead, Paul.
Thank you. Well, I'm a member of the California Federation of Teachers. I was in the union before I got elected to the state assembly, and so I favor the CFT's ballot initiative. In fact, they only concentrated on the very wealthy in their proposal, and they actually I contributed to the working out of the compromise with the governor in that regard, and I'm glad that the regressive tax dropped to 0.25% instead of 0.5% because I felt that was regressive, and of course the polling on the CFT ballot measure was always very high. It was always over 60% because you only tax the wealthy, and of course the wealthy is a minority member of the voting population, and so. Now that it's compromised and the governor has took on a lot of the CFT measures, they're taxing the wealthier taxpayers, and of course it's at 64% favorable rating right now. The USC just did a poll, and of course the Munger initiative is only polling at 32 or 33%, and so there's a reality that the Mungers will not make it, and in fact, if they increase their percentage, it will decrease the governor's percentage, the governor's tax initiative percentage. So the governor's tax initiative is on its way to victory, actually, if the Munger initiative stay in the same place. And so the best thing for the Munger initiative to do is to abandon the initiative so that the governor's initiative can sail through. Actually, that's my political interpretation of that. And as far as the single sales tax factor, the person is willing to forego it because we have a middle class scholarship that in the bill that we're all co-authors of in the state assembly. And the middle class scholarship will take from the single sales tax factor the loophole from out of state taxpayers. That will provide for $8,200 in scholarships for the UCs and $4,000 in scholarships for the CSUs. And so that person will forego the single sales tax factor if our middle class scholarship passes through the Assembly and the Senate.
Well, thank you. In fact, my next question was talking about how the Molly Munger flat rate proposal would jeopardize the governor's initiative, and you answered that very nicely. Joe, you have one more comment on this subject?
It occurs to me on this same topic, the question you asked, which I'm not sure we've ever wrestled to the ground, is what happens to K through 12 education if one of the tax measures does not pass. And I think that we ought to try and give as clear an answer on that as we possibly can. I would say over the last 3 or 4 years, K through 12 education has suffered about a 20% hit as compared or contrasted with where it, quote, should be if funding had simply risen at the level that was expected. And you see that in the classroom. If you look at school districts in our area and around the state, there are fewer teachers, they are teaching larger classes, they have less support from classified staff, and the school years are in fact shorter. The piece that's invisible to folks who aren't in the school world is that of the money that is sent to our K through 12 school districts, most people are not aware and don't have any reason to be. About 20% of that is, quote, deferred to the following year. What does that mean in plain English? It means that if, Diana, you're in the front row, so I'll pick on you. If you got paid $50,000 a year, but we said we don't have $50,000 a year to pay you, so we're going to take $10,000, 20% of your salary, and we're going to pay you next year, that's a deferral. For those of you who are of a certain age and your parents let you watch cartoons, some of you will remember I'll gladly pay you Thursday for a hamburger today. That's essentially what the state has done with public education. We've said, maybe you're entitled to $50,000, but we're going to give you $40,000 and we'll give you $10,000 next year. And then next year when you're entitled to $50,000 again, we're going to give you $40,000 that year and give you $10,000. So the money never quite is all there. And I see you scrunching your heads, but trust me, this is, Ben Pickard, you're here from Sunnyvale, that's what's happening, is there's this deferral. What happens if the ballot measures don't pass? The governor had planned, with the ballot measure passing, to start giving back the money in the year that it is owed, so that districts would actually be made whole for the year in which they provided instruction. So there is more money for public education in the governor's plan. It's largely invisible because essentially it's about paying people on time finally and getting out of that constant late payment mode. If the measure doesn't pass, then that ability goes away. That doesn't happen. The deferrals continue, and there's another $2 to $2.5 billion hit to public education on top. So whatever you see now gets worsened in terms of number of teachers who are in place, size of classes, classified support for the teachers who are there, and shorter school years, as Jerry, I think, mentioned earlier.
And Don, if I could add one other part to that, the one good thing, and there is a ray of hope related to this entire budget, and especially to K through 12, and that is that the legislature has made the commitment that the money that we have deferred, as Joe is speaking, and this is a different deferral, the deferral of the suspension of Prop 98 funding, which is the requirement that we meet certain standards in terms of financing for K through 12, that money that has been set aside that they did not receive, they will get that. It's a deferral or an IOU, and the legislative analyst, Mac Taylor, said that as soon as things do turn around, the funding will be there and paying back to K through 12, which will make them whole again. So there is a ray of sunshine. It's just that hopefully we don't abandon a generation of children as we're doing that.
Great, thank you. Pension reform and the urgency for pension reform. My question is, what do you see as the future direction of pension reform on a state level? Will we see minor revisions or a significant reduction of pension benefits? And why do you believe there is such a delay on the governor's pension proposal? You want to go ahead and start with this one, Rich?
Oh, boy. Well, let me start with the delay, because I'm not really convinced it is a delay. We in the legislature, I think we operate like a lot of us do in our daily lives, and that is we'll procrastinate if we can and wait to the last minute to do something. Certainly, that was my pattern in school when term papers were due. And I don't think the legislature is any different. The clock is ticking for us to the end of August. That's when we adjourn for the year and must conclude business. And so we have a conference committee that is working on the issue of pension reform. Conference committee is formed with members of the Senate and members of the Assembly working together. In fact, a couple of folks up here, I think, are you on that, Paul?
No.
No, Mr. Simitian is. sits on that conference committee. My anticipation is that the conference committee will complete some work that we will look at when we are in August, and that we will have some kind of action on pension reform before the end of the legislative year. I believe that that has to happen for a couple of reasons. I think there's serious and legitimate issues that are raised for us to consider in the public pension arena. And I believe that we must have some kind of demonstration that we are taking this issue, which is of great concern to many in the electorate. We must demonstrate that we're working on this issue, making some strides in order to be able to ask them to also support us with a tax increase. And I don't think you can get a tax increase on the November ballot unless you've made some advance on pension reform. The governor had a 12-point proposal. There are probably 4 or 5 of the elements of that proposal that will be fairly easy for us to adopt. There will be others where I think that we will see some compromise, and that's part of what the conference committee is working on, is trying to figure out what that would look like. And at the end of the day, what's important to remember is that some of what we do at the state level around pension reform may not have as significant an impact on all public pensions as you might think. In that, in reality, across the state, in our various cities and counties and other governmental units, you almost have a different public pension plan for each unit of government and each union that they've contracted with, because those pension plans are tied up in contracts. So it's not necessarily a one-size-fits-all. There are certain things that we can do at the state level, but making changes also will require us giving some ability for folks at the local level through their contracting and negotiating process to be able to make some additional changes.
Paul, I wanted you to comment maybe a little bit more on the pension reform, and Rich, sort of touched on it, but would the pension reform have an immediate impact on the state budget? And if not, how many years down the road would it be before any positive savings would really be realized?
Well, it would create a 2-tier system. It'd be a new tier, and it'd be with the new hirees, so it'd be down the road where we see the benefits. We won't see it immediately, but we'll see it down the road. When I was in the Foothill De Anza Community College District, we created a 2-tier system for lifetime health benefits. We were going to go $300 million in the hole by 2015 if we didn't create the 2-tier system. So sometimes you just have to create a 2-tier system just to alleviate the debt, and so that's why we're having a pension reform system, so that we're going to create a 2-tier system. I agree with about 9 of the points of the 12 points that the governor have, and so my input is that the age factor, 67, is too old. I mean, most people die before they're going to get to see their pension. So, we need to reduce the age, for one. And then the hybrid plan, the Stewards already, Cal Sturs already have the hybrid plan in place, and so PURs need to put the hybrid plan also in place, and so that's one that I agree with. And the contribution level of employees at 9% or something is just way too high. I think they should drop that to half of that amount. And so with that, I support everything else in the pension reform plan. The double dipping and the spiking needs to go away, and of course it's under review, and Joe Simitian's on the pension review committee. Is that, what's that called?
The Conference Committee on Pension Reform.
Conference Committee on Pension Reform, and Joe would probably have the best insight on what's going on at this time.
Thank you for that, Paul.
Before we get to Joe, Jerry Hill, would you like to comment on pension reform, and then we'll close this topic out with Joe Simitian.
Very, thank you, Don. Rich and Paul discussed and really mentioned the major issues that are involved. That I certainly agree that and support the idea that we have to look at some reform in pension. There are issues in the governor's 12-point program, most of them, and I think there is agreement for probably 10 of them, and negotiating for the other 2. And labor is on board, and they realize as well that there has to be some changes. In fact, the legislature, it was last year or the year before, when we repealed, was it AB 900? That was in
No, it's Senate Bill 400, and it was repealed back in 2010, I think, is what
10,
you're
so it was 2
thinking of.
years ago when we repealed a bill. This was back in 1999 when the economy was doing great, and I was a city council member at the time, and I remember when we were discussing then that PERS, the Public Employees Retirement System, was indicating that things are great. If you increase benefits, it will never cost you, won't cost you a cent, never have to pay anything. Well, there wasn't a lot of honesty in that statement, and nor was there a lot of transparency in that. And a lot of cities, local governments, counties decided to change their pension structure at that time and offer different benefits and reforms that went in a different direction. And unfortunately, the market turned, and all of a sudden, local government was saddled with tremendous debt and obligations that came from that. In that same light, the state had a similar bill that passed in 1999, increasing the benefits and lowering the retirement age to 55 in one case for regular employees. And in 2010, we repealed that law and went back to the system that was in place in 1999 or 1998 before that. So there have been some reforms already, but certainly more that are necessary, and I think we'll see more. Rich is correct. It'll be after the budget. This is really the priority now for the next couple of months, but it will not be ignored, and I believe there'll be some substantive decisions and changes in pensions.
Joe Simitian.
Thank you. As you heard earlier, there is a conference committee on pension reform. There are 6 members on that conference committee, 3 senators, 3 assembly members. I'm one of the 3 members of the Senate on that conference committee. I am there in large measure because for the last 2 years I've been working on one piece of this issue, which is the issue of so-called pension spiking. It's not a huge amount in terms of the dollar impact, but I think in terms of the abuses of the system, it's an area that has gotten what I would consider well-deserved attention. The conference committee process is a little obscure, but it's essentially designed to say, you know what, if we've got a lot of different conversations going on a complex topic, why don't we get everybody in the same room and thrash it out instead of having a dozen different competing bills? And that's the process that's underway right now. I think Rich Gordon's analysis is one I share. It'll get done first and foremost because there's a policy reason. It's a real issue and it's got to get tackled and solved. Second, and not insignificantly, there's not a snowball's chance that a tax measure is going to pass in November if the legislature and the governor don't do something that's real and significant about pension reform. Sometimes the right things happen for the wrong reasons. You may think that's the case in this instance, but if that ballot measure in November serves as a persuader, shall we say, for members of the legislature to tackle pension reform in a meaningful way, I think that's a good thing. Rich mentioned the complexity of it. Just to make that a little bit even bolder, think about it this way. There are 58 counties, there are 500 cities, there are 1,000 school districts, there are 5,000 special districts in California. Think about the fact that in every one of those jurisdictions there are at least a couple, and in some cases dozens, of local unions, bargaining units that have negotiated their own contracts. You do the math and you pretty quickly realize that there are thousands, if not tens of thousands, of contracts that have been negotiated. And so when you're talking about a single reform measure, you have to ask yourself, how do you unpack and repack all of those different agreements? And under constitutional law, you can't simply say, we're snapping our fingers and saying your contracts are no longer in place. That's not allowed. So that's part of the challenge. And I do think we'll get to a significant place. It may not be as far as the governor's proposal would like us to go, but I think it will be real and I think it will be significant.
Joe, maybe you could just share, you mentioned spiking for those that may not know.
Yeah, pension spiking is the phenomenon of artificially loading up your final year or years of employment's compensation so that you can then get an artificially inflated pension once you retire. And so if you suddenly get a promotion in your last year and look, it's, this happens in local government. I spent 17 years as a school board member, city council member, county supervisor, and somebody says, well, gee, we've gotten great service from Bob for the last 30 years. Why don't we make him an assistant vice president of and push a little more money his way? And then it doesn't seem like that much, an extra $10,000 in the final year of service, but if he's going to take an extra $6,000 per year out of the retirement system as a result, because he's entitled to 60% of that extra $10,000, then that number multiplies year after year after year. And it can be things as like deferring a uniform allowance, taking a vacation time that gets boosted towards the end. All of these are, and I want to be clear, I don't fault the employees. I mean, who in the room is going to go home and say to their spouse, honey, I deliberately reduced the amount of retirement we're going to be able to collect in our later years? That the problem's not with the employees in most cases. The problem is with a system that not only allows that, but encourages that. So we need to fix that system, because it's one of the things that I think is the most egregious abuse of the system. It's probably $100 million a year on a statewide level, which is a small piece of the larger problem, but it is a piece that I think is the most obvious candidate for reform, and it's one where I think we finally have a consensus that that's something we got to address in the reform package.
I want to remind you that there are blue cards in the back. You can raise your hand, and one of the people in the back will bring you a blue card. I want to talk a little about the economy and California's competitiveness. California has a reputation of having an extraordinary job force, talent, climate, quality of life, and cities like Sunnyvale, Santa Clara, Mountain View are all doing relatively well as far as recruitment and retention and expansion. But we're at a disadvantage by having a much higher cost of housing, very stringent state regulations compared to other states, for example, Texas. And my question is, what efforts are taking place in Sacramento to establish a favorable business climate in California to retain and recruit businesses for our state? And why don't we have Jerry start with that one?
Great, thank you, Don. And that's probably the most crucial issue that we have today, because all we've been talking about this morning is the lack of funding, the lack of resources available to provide the needs to sustain the quality of life that we all enjoy in California and certainly in the Valley. And a lot of that is dependent upon the success of our business community throughout the state and the resources that they're able to provide for that quality of life. And so it's important that government be a partner with business, and I think there is certainly a trend in Sacramento looking in that direction with many of the issues that come forward. And there are a lot of issues, regulatory reform. I'm fortunate enough, I chair the Select Committee on Biotechnology. And I did that as a San Mateo County supervisor because I saw the benefit that industry brought to the community. Good, high-paying, clean jobs. And when the dot-com bust hit in 2000, that industry was thriving after that, and kept unemployment very low, housing prices high. So I wanted to see how can we do that and foster that throughout the state. And a number of issues came up in the hearings that we've had around the state, but one in particular, and I think I'm just going to cite this example, but more importantly, how this example, I think, plays out in multiple ways throughout the legislature today, and looking at some of the reforms. We're talking about pension reform. There's also regulatory reform. One example, in the bio-life sciences industry today, if the Federal Drug Administration comes in and does their inspections, it takes weeks of time, hundreds of thousands of dollars to do that. And following right on their heels is the State Food and Drug Branch, which comes in and does almost the identical inspection that the FDA just did. Well, I have legislation now that will eliminate that redundancy in regulatory oversight. I mean, the state has a role in certain areas, but why should we be doing it? And I think that's what we're looking at throughout the system to try and make those reforms. And I think that there's a palatable and certainly a receptive audience now in Sacramento, because in that bioscience, there are 270,000 jobs in California in that one industry. And then when you take the Valley with high tech, the gaming, and the other industries, we have to look at each area, because we don't want to lose that innovation economy that we have, especially here. And now Rich has been working and doing a lot on CEQA reform and as a priority. And he's kind of taken the lead in that in a lot of ways, and really pleased. But that's an indication that we're looking at all areas of making it better and making California a little more business friendly.
Paul, would you like to comment on the California's competitiveness and some of the things that are going on in Sacramento?
Sure. SB 617, a bill by Calderon and Pavley, eliminated duplication of bills and regulations and streamlined a lot of the efforts that were going, and that was the initial bill that came out. And of course, AB 29 by John Perez is, initiated a Go Biz economic development department in the state. So we're promoting businesses and economic development, and also looking at permitting process and trying to streamline the process as well, trying to stop the duplication of efforts in our bureaucracy. And there is an effort, as Jerry Hill mentioned, there's a strong effort by all of us in the Assembly and the Senate in that direction, going in that direction of trying to streamline our government and make it easier for businesses to permit and to get started and to grow. Because 80% of our businesses are small businesses, only 20% are big business. And I chair the Select Committee on High Technology, doing the same thing for what Jerry does for biotechnology, and trying to promote the innovation economy and just looking at all the reforms that we need to promote our businesses. And so it's a strong effort in the State Assembly and the State Senate right now, and it's great momentum, actually.
Rich, you work quite a bit with CEQA, and maybe I can just sort of segue into a CEQA question also. And CEQA, for those who don't know, is the California Environmental Quality Act, and it's a statute that requires state and local agencies to identify the significant environmental impacts of their actions and to avoid or mitigate those impacts. How do we balance CEQA regulations between protecting our environment and becoming a detriment to business? And are CEQA and environmental regulations becoming too strict and hindering business?
Let me start by going back. The CEQA legislation, California's Environmental Quality Act, is 40 years old. And when it was first initiated, the idea was that you would take a look at a project, a development, an activity, and evaluate it for its environmental impact. And you would look at were there ways in which you could not do any harm to the environment through the project. What has evolved over a 40-year period of time is a system that is now more designed, oftentimes, to guarantee that you do a review that keeps you from getting sued. One of the advantages of CEQA is that we actually have better projects in California. Things that we build are better. One of the disadvantages of CEQA is that oftentimes at the end of the process, folks will use CEQA not for the purpose of evaluating environmental quality, but for the purpose of trying to stop the project. Give you an example from the city of San Jose. It's a minor project, 2 gas stations on opposite street corners. One gas station wanted to install a second pump. That required a CEQA review. The city approved it. The CEQA process is now under a lawsuit by the owner of the other gas station, who did not want the guy across the street to get a competitive advantage with a second pump. It had nothing to do with whether the environment was going to be harmed in any way, shape, or form, although the claim in the suit is that there will be more traffic if the guy has the second pump. That's not really what it's about. And so there are things that we need to be looking at to make sure that CEQA does what it was designed to do. and that is to protect the environment and to enhance our projects. There are a number of folks working on these issues in the legislature. Senator Simitian has been a leader, taking kind of incrementally, bringing forward bits and pieces, because it is something that would be very difficult to try to do kind of a massive reform. Some of the things that are being looked at in the legislature relative to CEQA reform have to do with how records are kept in the process, so that if something does go to suit, things could be resolved sooner because there's a court record available sooner. There's also some discussion about a phenomenon in the CEQA process that is affectionately known as document dumping. What that means is that on the very last hour of the CEQA review timeframe, an opponent will come in with volumes of comments that all then have to be responded to, all of which leads to further delay of a project. There's some examination of, how do you deal with that problem? And there's also an examination and discussion about the fact that 40 years ago, when we had CEQA first initiated, in those days we didn't have a Clean Water Act, we didn't have a Clean Air Act. There are certain standards now that we have, and could we apply those kind of as a given within CEQA? So there are robust discussions going on. You'll see, I think, some incremental movement, and I think this is a topic that will be in the legislature for the next 3 to 4 years.
Thank you. Paul, what are your comments on the California's competitiveness, and what can you add to some of helping prevent some of the regulations from hindering California businesses? And then we'll close out with Joe on this topic too.
Okay. As Rich mentioned, that we're making some incremental progress on CEQA reform. We approved a LA Stadium deal last year, and we shortened the litigation review period to 6 months from 18 months, and that would shorten the process by a year. And that kind of incremental approach needs to be expanded, as well as SB 375 is an incremental approach in terms of reforming CEQA as well. It allows for residential development in transportation corridors, and it expedites it considerably. And so those are two measures that under CEQA reform that we're working on, and I think we need to do more.
Great. A couple of questions for Joe Simitian. One is, we hear about the disadvantages from the state, and do you think those disadvantages of the state are actually forcing businesses to leave, or is it merely a perceived threat? I know we're pretty healthy here, but it could happen any time where people could start leaving. And another somewhat disrelated subject is, what impact do the legislators in Sacramento have in streamlining the environmental regulations for the construction and maintenance of the state and local water projects?
Okay, let me see if I can bundle a couple of those together by way of a response. On the environmental review issue, I think it's helpful to understand the political environment in Sacramento, and it's very different than the way we do our work in local government. And I think everybody here has had experience in local government, and they would tell you it's just a different world when you get into the highly charged partisan environment, whether it's in Washington or Sacramento. In this council chamber and in council chambers around the county and the state, people say, oh, we have a problem. Let's see if we can find a solution. Why don't we all sit down around the table? I'm looking at your faces, and you think, well, that doesn't sound all that exciting or intriguing, or like that's new information. Compared to the way work gets done in the Capitol, it's a very satisfying experience. We talk about the CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act. In Sacramento, this is almost a religious debate. You have one group of people who think that CEQA is the holy grail. You have another group of people that think CEQA is the great Satan, that they do battle in terms and language that's almost apocalyptic. You know, the world will come to an end if we don't fix CEQA. No, the world will come to an end if we allow even a word in CEQA to be dealt with. I took this issue on because I chair the Senate Environmental Quality Committee, and after 2 or 3 years of getting what I thought were very ill-conceived proposals about so-called CEQA reform, people said, well, all right, we know what you're against. Are you for anything? And I thought that's a fair question. So I said I would step up and start to make progress year by year in what I thought were manageable chunks. Did that 2 years ago, had some good success. Did it again last year, had some success, was able to do most of this on a bipartisan basis. And if you are chair of the Senate Environmental Quality Committee and you have a 99% voting record with the League of Conservation Voters, it's a little hard for people to point their finger at you and say you're trying to dismantle CEQA. So I had some ability to be a little bit more ambitious in the area than maybe somebody else whose credentials in the environmental arena were not as good. Now, I have to tell you, what's challenging about this work is, and I brought a prop today. So 2 years ago, I did a bill called Senate Bill 226 that was my sort of second effort at CEQA reform. The folks in the developer community who always want more dismissed it as sort of inconsequential. Let me tell you how folks in the environmental community responded. With a full-page ad in the LA Times assailing the legislation and calling on Governor Brown not to do this and explaining all of the horrors that would befall the state if Senator Simitian's SB 226 was passed and signed into law. So again, on one side of the debate, you had folks in the building world who were saying, not that helpful. You had folks in the, in this case, the LA Neighbors United, saying, oh my gosh, apocalypse is about to befall us if Simitian's Bill 226 gets passed. We've got to put all that aside and say, how can you actually look at this particular tool and make it a tool that can be used for good purposes, as Rich said earlier, and not so easily used for bad purposes. That's the first thing I would say. On the waterfront, I would just say, I think we made real progress 3 years ago with a series of bills that fundamentally changed California water law. And this was an area where I decided to wade in because I thought somebody who hadn't been part of the same fight for the last 25 years needed to step up and try and play a role. And people reacted differently to that. There were a bunch of people in the water world who said, who invited you to our party? And I said, actually, I invited myself. And it dealt with fundamentally the question of how are we going to take care of the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta, which most of you, certainly I, drive through, don't give a lot of thought to. Guess what? It's the source of water for 2/3 of the state. The myth is that it's all water that gets sent down to Southern California where they, quote, steal our water. The fact is 50% of Santa Clara County's water comes from that delta. So if it crashes, we lose. And that's not only a huge issue for us as individuals, it's a huge issue for Santa Clara County businesses who rely on that water source. I am not kidding when I tell you I invited myself, and here's what happened. Actually, I had a staff member who encouraged me to do this, and I said, I want no part of it. It's not a productive conversation. And he said, well, let me tell you why you should do it. And he said, well, it probably can't happen in the assembly because with term limits and 2-year terms, you're going to need a long period of time to work on this. So it probably needs to start with somebody in the Senate who has some time ahead of him, which I did back in 2005 when I had this conversation. So that narrows it down to 40 senators. And then they said probably needs to be somebody in the majority party because you'll need to work with your colleagues to move this forward. And I said, all right, well, that narrows it down to 25 Senate Democrats. And then they said it can't be somebody from Southern California or from an ag district because they'll be perceived as having an axe to grind. And I said, well, okay, that narrows it down to about 8 members of the Senate. And then they said when it really needs to be somebody who comes from a district where he's got impeccable environmental credentials so people don't think you're going to degrade the Delta. And if he happened to be the chair of the Senate Environmental Quality Committee, so much the better. And now you understand how people persuade themselves in Sacramento that they're indispensable to the conversation. That's really how it happened. And it turned out that all of that was true. And this package of reforms that happened in 2009 said something that will sound so simple and common sense to you that you'll think, I can't believe they spent years getting to this place. it said that we would have co-equal goals for the Delta. Water reliability, that we would have an adequate supply of quality water, and environmental protection for the Delta, which is the biggest estuary on the Pacific coast in North or South America. For years, people had been making this an either-or debate. Either it was about the water or it was about the environment. And so all that happened was people were at loggerheads year after year after year. The legislation said, no, we're actually going to say that these are co-equal goals. As we move forward, we'll move forward with both of those in mind. Created a structure to do that with a newly constituted Delta Stewardship Council, which I created in the bill that I authored, a newly constituted conservancy for the Delta to address the environmental issues in particular, and we are now building on that work going forward. Water is one of the most excruciatingly tedious issues in state government, in my view. There's some people who love it, who just love to, let's rumble about water. It's not really not the way I look at it, but it's a huge issue that needed to be tackled, and I think we got a pretty good start on it back in 2009, and I think that's playing out well in the subsequent years.
Don, if I might, I want to go back to the question you started this series of discussions with, and that having to do with businesses leaving the state. And I just want to put a marker down for all of us, and that's this. We will probably never be able to compete, certainly with foreign countries and maybe with many other states, when it comes to wages, given the cost of living here. What makes this place, particularly the Valley, work is our productivity. That's how we outcompete with other places. And our productivity is directly related to the educational attainment and our creativity, our ingenuity. And so the marker is this. What is most troubling for this region and our success economically is not what we do with regulations from the state, not necessarily what we do with taxes, but what we do relative to the underinvestment in our education system to produce the qualified workforce that helps us keep this region strong.
Jerry?
Don, I just wanted to add, and Rich is absolutely correct, that Joe was the best person to look into the issue of water in California because of that, how he fit into that dynamic that he described, which I think is very unique. And the troubling part is in Sacramento that, as Joe mentioned early on, so many times when a certain author authors something that may be contrary to what he would normally or she would normally bring forward, there's always a suspicious. People are the suspect of what they're doing. What's the motive behind that? This is kind of different than they would do. Or if you take in some business groups, if the environmental community comes forward with legislation or something, they automatically, it's almost a knee-jerk reaction that you see. Unlike what you find in local government, where everyone is looking to the common good without all of these pressures, you see that in Sacramento, where it's a knee-jerk reaction, that they're opposed to it. And in many cases, I don't think they've even read it. It's just who the author is, where the base is for that, and it's both sides. It's not just, I'm not just saying the environmental community, I'm not saying the business community. It's almost everyone universally. And that's the issue that's hard to overcome, and that's why Joe, because of his strength and leadership, was the one selected for that, because he kind of crosses all of those bounds.
Do you have anything else to add, Paul, on this topic, or are you ready to go to the next one?
Well, just to add on to our competitiveness and our economy, Campaign for College Opportunity did a report, and they found that we'll be 1 million college graduates short for our economy by the year 2025. And so we need to produce more college graduates to feed our economy, and that's the point that Rich Gordon made. That's only. And also water policy is something that's geographic. It's bipartisan, and it's geographic in nature. It depends on where you're located at, is where your position is on the water policy.
Great, thank you. Let's talk a little bit about Proposition 13. And Proposition 13 occurred back when I was just a little pup, but it's still out there. And what it did is it it controlled the property tax on homes and businesses, and it pretty much regulated it, so it's about 1.25% of the purchase price. Now, there's been considerable discussion and even support to revise Proposition 13. And first of all, is it even possible? And secondly, who would gain and who would lose? How would it change the function of the state and the counties and education funding? And I do have a follow-up question, but let's just start with that on just maybe the feasibility and the impacts of even attempting to change Proposition 13, and can it be done? Paul, you want to start on this one?
Sure, it can be done. We need a split roll tax because back in '78, 40% of the taxes were paid by residential taxes and 60% were paid by commercial taxes. Now it's 35% of the taxes are paid by commercial and 65% are paid by residential taxes. That formula needs to be equalized. And of course, we need to do a split roll tax, but in order to do it right, we need to not affect our small businesses and our apartment dwellers, because the taxes would be passed on to the apartment dwellers if it's not reassessed properly in the commercial and also to our small businesses under a triple net lease. And that could bankrupt our small businesses. We need to get our economy going right now, and we cannot affect our small businesses in a negative way. And so it can be done, but we need to craft it in a way where the commercial folks that have not paid or been reassessed need to be reassessed. But it cannot affect those who in triple net leases of their small businesses and those who in apartment dwellers. And so if we can do that, we could craft a equalizing formula, and it's under a split roll tax for Prop 13.
Jerry Hill, Prop 13, what do you think?
Well, Don, thank you. I mean, Prop 13 has been considered, and most of us realize it's that third rail of politics in the legislature and just about anywhere in terms of it. I don't think there's anything that creates more thought, more anxiety among people in Sacramento or locally because of the challenges that are faced by it. I think there are some issues that have been raised with Proposition 13, that some of the corporate structures and the financing that have prevented reassessment of property through kind of things that were unintended by Proposition 13 when it was designed and written, that could be changed to improve and to increase the revenue that's generated from it, but also to be more fair and equal. But I don't think we're going to see anything politically coming from any reforms or changes from Proposition 13, because what would happen, as I see it, when you attempt something, regardless of how fair, benign it may be to everyone, or something that could be workable, or as Paul was talking, the minute that happens, there will be such a backlash, such a reaction, that people will frame it as the camel's nose under the tent. Here, people go trying to take away seniors, our ability to preserve and stay in our homes, and I think that Prop 13 was a reaction to local government and state government not doing their job, not providing appropriate tax policies and having a fair system, and this was kind of an overreaction to that. I think that there are some changes that could occur, but I don't see them happening in the near term.
Rich Gordon, your comments on Proposition 13, and then we'll close with Joe Simitian.
First of all, I think it is long past time for us in California to have a comprehensive conversation about our tax policy. There are several key issues that I think need to be a part of that conversation. One of them is that we, in this state, have a fairly heavy reliance on the income tax as a primary source of income. And one of the things that does at the state level is make our we have high volatility, peaks and valleys as the economy changes. We don't have a stable source of income for the state when we have that heavy reliance. We have a very regressive sales tax, and Prop 13 needs to be discussed. What I would remind you is that there were several things that I think were consequences intended or unintended, of Prop 13, which have really changed the landscape and need to be a part of a broader conversation. Paul mentioned specifically split roll. What percentage do commercial and business property tax owners pay as compared to residential? I'd also note that there's also this phenomenon that people are paying very different amounts of property tax. The young family that moved in next door to us last year, they're paying 10 times in property tax what I pay. I don't think they're getting 10 times more service from the government. There's an inequality and an unfairness that has occurred that probably needs to be addressed. The other dynamic, Prop 13 brought us the 2/3 vote requirement, which is called the supermajority. I grew up at a time when in school they taught us about majority vote, and so I've never quite understood what's so super about a supermajority. And then the other dynamic, and I think it's a key one of Prop 13, is that it shifted an awful lot of our government control from local government to the state. So if we're going to have a conversation about Prop 13 and the tax structure in California, and I believe that we should have that conversation, we also need to take into account these other issues. How do we return and link again taxation with where the services occur? How do we link the property tax back to school districts and cities? It's decoupled now because of the way and the nature of Prop 13 moving the resources to the state level for state decision. So I think there's a broad conversation to be had. I think we have to have it in this state. It is one that is difficult because of the holy grail that is Prop 13, but one we must have.
So I have, a question I have is has there been any discussion in Sacramento? Has anyone spearheaded what a revision of Proposition 13 might look like? Is there anybody working on that, or is that just another brick wall? Joe?
Well, I think my assessment of the political climate is that meaningful change to Prop 13 is a non-starter for the foreseeable future. So, while we can have a policy conversation about what might make sense, what would be good for California, what would be good for our local communities, if you're asking me by the end of this decade, do I anticipate any meaningful change to Prop 13, the answer is absolutely not, and that's where my $5 in the office pool would go if somebody asked me to put my $5 on the line. And I'll give you just one example, and I'm smiling because it's back to newspaper ads again, but I have proposed for the last several years what I consider a very modest tweak, which is that I have legislation that would allow for a 55% threshold for school parcel taxes. You will remember back in 2000, we voted as a state to reduce the 2/3 threshold for school bonds from 2/3 to 55%. I would like the state to have the opportunity to vote on a measure that would say, let's take that 2/3 threshold for parcel taxes for schools and reduce it to 55% as well. Whenever I introduce this, the Howard Jarvis organization runs a 2-page ad in the Sacramento Bee assailing this, quote, assault on Prop 13. Now, whether you agree or disagree with the proposal that I've just made, it's hard to characterize that tweak as an assault on Prop 13. The proposal is that we let the public decide whether the local public should decide by still a supermajority how to spend their own money on their own kids. Again, you might think it's a bad idea, you may say, but it's if we get that kind of reaction to a modest tweak, imagine what a wholesale overhaul would entail. And frankly, the public is not supportive. Our area is a bit of a bubble, folks. When people come to town halls, and I'm sure my colleagues have the same experience, say, well, why don't you just raise our taxes? I have to smile and say, the rest of the state's not really like Santa Clara County, actually. They have a different point of view on this, and so the rest of the state is very skeptical about any touching of Prop 13. Second point is, and this goes to the issue of split roll, I do think that if we are unsuccessful with any tax measure in November on sort of a more comprehensive basis, you will see a flurry of taxes targeting business from individual tax advocacy groups. You will see folks rush forward and say, let's do an oil severance tax. You'll see another group step forward and say, let's do a split roll property tax. Different folks will come with different proposals, because if the more comprehensive statewide approach fails, they'll say, look, nobody loves oil companies, we can go after them. Nobody loves big commercial owners, we can go after them. And so I think you're likely to see it there. And the last thing I want to do is pick up on the issue that Rich raised about the unintended consequences. In the school world, I see this particularly. I meet very few people who say, yes, we actually think it would be helpful if Sacramento were more involved in the daily operation of our local schools. That's not a comment I get at sidewalk office hours or in town halls. But as Rich hinted, once the funding responsibility shifted to the state, then the policy setting role shifted to the state as well. I served on the Palo Alto School Board. People are sometimes surprised to learn that David Packard, as in Hewlett-Packard, served on the Palo Alto School Board before I did. And people said, really? David Packard wanted to serve on the Palo Alto School Board? Well, yeah, because in those days, the school board actually got to set the tax rate, determine what the budget was for their district, and make decisions about what was in the best interest of the kids and their community and what it would cost to get the job done. Does David Packard want to serve on the local school board now, when the shift has been to a system where the state of California will provide you with what resources it can, probably inadequate? They will tie your hands in terms of the flexibility you'd like to have to make decisions about local needs and local kids. Oh, and then, by the way, you get to have the accountability as the local school board member when parents are irate about the way you have handled their most treasured thing, their kids. That's not a job description that is appealing today as it was 50 years ago in the pre-Prop 13 world.
Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about redevelopment. You know how it's affected so many cities. Some cities are more affected than others. Sunnyvale has somewhat survived it because we didn't rely heavily on it, but nevertheless, over 20 years, Sunnyvale alone has lost over $100 million in redevelopment money. And my question is like, what is the state of the cleanup legislation for redevelopment? Where is the money moving to? How is it going to affect the state, pluses or minuses? How is it going to affect the cities, pluses or minuses? If we could, I think we'll start with Jerry Hill on this, but give us a little background on the concept and philosophy behind this new redevelopment movement and how it's going to work.
Well, I think we have to step back and look at redevelopment historically and why it's no longer in place. As you saw last year, the governor in his budget, the governor had a number of problems with redevelopment and the history of redevelopment, how it had operated, some of the abuses that we've seen around the state. Pretty much in the valley and on the peninsula, we've seen some successes with redevelopment, a lot of good use, and especially with the 20% housing set aside, we've seen some good affordable housing built in an area with real challenges to providing or finding affordable housing with the high cost of housing that we have. So redevelopment was, but the problem with redevelopment that the governor realized and many of us saw is that when you have trying times, that tax increment that comes for redevelopment agencies is derived from or taken away from some of the other taxing agencies. And that would be schools, that would be counties, and basically cities as well, lose some of that money that then will go into a pot that they can use for affordable housing as well as economic development. And it's a good concept. And it works well, and it worked well when things were going well. The problem that we found is that when we're cutting billions from education, this is money that the governor realized and the legislature looked at that is coming from education, that could go back into education, perhaps at the expense of economic development, but where do we prioritize and how do we make that decision? So that's really where it started. Now, after the redevelopment was ABX 26 is the bill last year that eliminated redevelopment, but the legislature felt that there was still a need for economic development, still a need for affordable housing. And there was a complementary bill of ABX 27, which kind of reinstated redevelopment in a form that did not take away from education, but provided some of the economic development potential for the future. And those bills were challenged in court by the League of California Cities and the Redevelopment Association of California, saying that the state did not have the right, basically, to dismantle redevelopment and move forward with the other plan. The problem is that the courts decided against the cities and in favor of the state, and found that the state did have the authority to eliminate redevelopment agencies and did not have to go forward with the ABX 27. So the challenge that we're faced with today is how do we, the redevelopment agencies are being dismantled, but it's just as Joe was talking about, the 500 cities in California, every redevelopment agency is different, completely different in the manner in which it's structured, the amount it has used for different types of funding and economic development and housing development as well. So what we've been doing, and I was fortunate to sit on, and I still do, a task force in the Assembly. There are 5 members who have been charged with developing a strategy for exiting out of the old redevelopment to try and look for amendments that we've crafted that will solve some of the local problems that have been identified throughout the state, so that the exit strategy can protect the interest and especially the housing money in those local redevelopment agencies as they terminate out. That bill is now stalled in the legislature. There are a number of bills that have moved forward and a number of opportunities that are also kind of put on the back burner at this point in time. My assumption is that the phasing out, the continued phasing out process and how to deal with the money will be part of the budget trailer bill language that we will see in the next couple of months, or next month actually, and it will be fit into that. And as we move forward with the new economic development strategy for California, or redevelopment 2.0, that will be designed over the next probably 6 or 8 months as we look at different options and opportunities, because I think we all recognize that there is a direct need for economic development if it's done right, if it's done honestly, done with the transparency, and we actually see economic development and housing as part of that. And so it's to develop the tools that could be used and utilized in order to get us to that point. And that's really the challenge, because here again, in everything, this is a large state with a lot of different needs and interests throughout, and we have to craft something that will work for that. But I do see it coming, because I think there's a direct commitment on the part, certainly of the Assembly, to do that.
Paul, just a general overview on your feelings on redevelopment, but also, is there any effort or plan by the state to backfill the void left by redevelopment, or the loss of it?
Yes, AB 1585 was a bill that we prepared in the Assembly to backfill almost everything that we took away from the local cities and the redevelopment agencies. The general fund will gain annually about $1.5 billion from dissolution of the redevelopment agencies, and education is supposed to get some of that money. But there are other pieces of legislation, including SB 986 Dutton redevelopment bond proceeds, SB 1151 Steinberg redevelopment long-range asset management plan, and SB 1156 Steinberg community development plan. Those are all actively trying to reinstate some portions of the redevelopment monies for the local cities and the redevelopment agencies. And so we're trying to make all the local redevelopment agencies whole again, to the best of our ability. And so we're working on that. And I've been in touch with the cities in my district, working closely with trying to craft stuff to accommodate their needs as well.
Great. Can everyone hear us okay out there still? Good. Good. Joe Simitian, what's the fate of the cities that have significant redevelopment projects in motion right now? Is this going to be phased? Are they looking at economic shortfalls? And your overall comments on redevelopment?
Well, let me start with a couple of random thoughts about redevelopment. And the one that was hinted at but nobody has said out loud just yet is, for decades we thought that redevelopment was free money. it's not free money. It's a reallocation of money from one place to another place. It falls, in my view, in sort of the same category as bond debt in California. People think, oh, we'll pass a bond, that's free money. No, it's not free money. We have, the way redevelopment works, for those of you who are not familiar, is with something called tax increment financing. So we declare a redevelopment area in a particular community, and then when there's growth in property tax over time, instead of that property tax going, as Jerry said, to the city or the school district or the county, it got pushed over to the redevelopment agency for what we hoped were their good works. And people, as I say, sort of thought, oh, free money. Well, no, that was money that wasn't going to the county or the city or the school districts. Now, post-Prop 13, since the state was backfilling the shortage for school districts, most school districts didn't care that much because they said, well, you know, if we lose that money to our redevelopment agency, no big deal. The state will backfill and we'll be left whole. That worked when the state was prosperous enough to backfill, but when the state said, hey, we're broke too, then all of a sudden school districts realized, you know what, if we can't count on the state and we don't have access to our own property tax money, we've got a problem. So eventually there was this realization that it's not free money, it was a redistribution, and you can think it was a good one or a bad one, but that's really the nature of the tension about where do those dollars go and who has priority for spending them. I couldn't help but think when you asked how's the cleanup going, the answer is the cleanup is messy. This is a very complicated issue, and we're trying to untangle it now. I'll come back to that in a minute. I also want to say this is an area where at the state level, the political debate was not a very encouraging one. We're in a place we shouldn't be. People, again, on this one got too polarized. They staked out tough positions. Folks in the RDA world said over our dead bodies, and it turned out it was over their dead bodies. And I don't think that's been a benefit to the state. I have always been sort of a mend it, don't end it guy on redevelopment. I have 3 different counties in my district, so I have had an opportunity to see in different jurisdictions both the good uses and the bad uses. Maybe my colleagues can help me a little on the one that became just sort of a running gag in Sacramento is that within 2 blocks of the Capitol, there's a place called the Dive Bar. For the record, I've never been to the Dive Bar. The reason it was called the Dive Bar is, among other things, it has a oversized aquarium that has a mermaid in it, as I understand it. Again,
Mermen too.
Mermaid and mermen. I've never been to the Dive Bar. Why am I telling you this story? Because it was an RDA financed project. So when people said, you know, what are we using RDA for? People would say, oh, the Dive Bar. You know, your tax dollars at work funding the mermaid. Okay, that is one end of the debate. The other end of the debate is the extraordinary good work that's been done in communities around my district and around the state. But this was not the kind of debate that you should take any satisfaction in. It really did get polarized very quickly. We ended up with winners and losers when we should have been able to sort this out going forward. But again, in terms of where we're going, I don't think anyone knows. I think trying to predict today, even though August 31st is not that far off, where we're going to end up is a bit of a fool's errand. I do think there's a lot of support for the affordable housing component of the work that RDAs have done. I do worry, however, with respect to your question about what happens to cities who are in process, that affordable housing money may disappear as the state is forced to confront an ever-growing budget shortfall. I think when we see that May revise from the governor on Monday, that may not spell good news for those housing funds.
Rich, more on redevelopment, but specifically, what do you know about how this money from the redevelopment is being redistributed? How's it being filtered back and out into the community, whether it's state or local?
Well, certainly the property tax increment that was being collected by redevelopment agencies now is in the hands of the state. We are using it to fund general activities. So it's, we're using part of that money to meet the budget requirements of schools. We're using part of it to pay for other services. And so there's not necessarily any direct immediate correlation that this was money being collected in a community and that money's coming back to community. No, it's being collected by the state and being used for general purposes. What I want to comment on for just a moment is the cleanup effort and the legislation that both my colleagues, Mr. Hill and Mr. Fong, referred to, that the Assembly adopted. The Assembly took action to try to deal with some of the legal issues that occurred as local jurisdictions were told they had to wind down their redevelopment agencies. There were a whole host of unintended consequences in the action to close down. In particular, the city of Sunnyvale, very hard hit by an action that was taken that would not allow the redevelopment agency to repay loans that the city had given it. That means the city's out money that isn't available. The cleanup legislation that has been approved by the Assembly would help that situation in Sunnyvale and would actually be very beneficial to this city. It's one of the reasons that I strongly support it. Now, that cleanup language was tied in the legislation, which allowed the communities to keep their housing set-aside money. So what I think happens, and my colleagues have talked about this, and let me just be more specific. I think what happens is that in the budget process, we say the part of the cleanup bill that deals with some of the technical and legal issues, that's okay, we'll move that forward. But the part of the bill that says that communities can keep their housing set aside, we sweep that back, keep that for general purposes, given the depth of the financial problem that the state's going to face. I think that's how we move that forward. And then I think there is a conversation that will occur about what do we do in the future to give local communities the tools that they need to do economic development. What's that look like? How does the state assist in that regard? Because I think we need a program. It'll have to be different than what redevelopment was, but we need something to do that. And then the second part of that will be that we will find a way to assist communities with affordable housing. That was, key part of the redevelopment was the fact that 20% of that tax increment, that extra tax dollar, was kept for affordable housing. We'll find an alternative for that, and there are several suggestions being made, whether that would be a fee on a recording of a real estate document or some other mechanism that would allow the local jurisdictions to collect money for affordable housing, but that'll also be a part of what we discuss moving forward.
I'm going to keep this one to just a short answer or two, but very, very brief, because it is a little bit out of Sacramento's jurisdiction, but Silicon Valley is hands down the leader in patents in the country. There's nobody that can compete with us, and even some of our individual cities lead the world in patents per capita. What role, if any, does Sacramento have in lobbying for federal R&D tax credits or expediting patents, which is a big issue, or FDA approval? Does Sacramento have any control or power in helping us with that, or is that a federal issue and out of our jurisdiction? Paul?
Well, I supported Nora Campos's bill, which would request a patent office here in Silicon Valley. Since we produce the most patents in the country, we need a patent office here. So we signed a letter to the federal government to request that they put a patent office here in Silicon Valley. And so we're putting, I think all of us signed that letter. We signed that letter, yeah.
We'd like it in Sunnyvale.
Yeah. Well, Silicon Valley, it's hopefully it's in Sunnyvale. But
And if I could just add,
Good man.
Congresswoman Anna Eshoo has been such a strong advocate. I mean, kudos go to her for her fight to maintain the innovation industries that we have and the businesses, and especially in light of trying to advocate to locate a patent office in the Valley. It's crucial. I think we've all signed on to one letter or another in support of that, but it is a federal issue. And unfortunately, as we know, the politics of federal elections and the presidency, California there's not a lot of question as to where California will go in the presidential election. So that's, that patent office will probably, if it hasn't already been allocated to a state that has more political discretion, I guess, when it comes to the presidential election, which is unfortunate.
What do you see as how much impact do we have in Sacramento on the federal government? Or are they doing have their own agenda?
I don't think we have a lot of impact on the federal government. I mean, obviously, locally, those of us who serve in the legislature have a great relationship with our congressional delegation. We work very closely together on issues. You know, we continue to be what is known as a donor state. We pay more in federal taxes than we get back. And we're often, I think, you know, because of the political nature that Jerry was talking about a minute ago, sometimes we don't get as much attention from the federal government in the current political climate. You know, it's a work in progress.
Anything more on that?
I'm gonna take the question in a slightly different tack, and this I'm gonna put the audience on the spot if they'll let me. Speaking of federal government, I had a chance to meet yesterday with Secretary of Transportation Ray LaHood, who was out from Washington, D.C. In support of the high-speed rail efforts. I'm going to ask you in a minute for a show of hands, and if you don't want to raise your hand, you won't. How many of you would like to see California move forward with high-speed rail, and how many are opposed? How many of you would like to see California move forward with high-speed rail? How many of you are opposed? Okay, thanks. That was a little helpful spot survey here in the room. So thank you, appreciate it.
And just another quick question before we move into some questions from the audience. And I'm not sure if all of you or just some of you have worked with both Governor Brown and Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger. I know Joe has. Joe, could you start off by telling us what are the differences? You had a Republican, you have a Republican governor that you might know, and you have a Democrat governor now that it may be hard to predict. What do you see with the differences in working with them?
I actually have worked with all three governors. With three governors, going back to Governor Gray Davis as well. You know, in an office with the responsibility of the governor, the personality of the governor comes through. I want you to stop and think about the three people I just mentioned. Gray Davis, Arnold Schwarzenegger, and Jerry Brown. These are not exactly three peas in a pod. These are very different folks. And they all had their strengths, and respectfully, they all had their weaknesses. I actually worked quite comfortably with the Schwarzenegger administration, which is the administration I worked with the longest, just by virtue of when I happened to be there, and he was there for 7 years. You know, Governor Schwarzenegger was very clear about the fact that he did not come from government. He did not have a background in government. He didn't pretend to have a background in government, and actually he didn't want to have a background in government. I remember somebody asking him, had he read something, and he waved his hand and said, I have people who read things for me. You know, that was sort of his view. He had a notion of himself as sort of being the salesman in chief and the big picture guy, and then he had staff. That was how he had, some of you will remember famously, he had the smoking tent out in the courtyard where cigars were smoked. I remember having a conversation with him in my role as chair of the Senate Environmental Quality Committee, along with Fran Pavley, about AB 32, the global warming bill, and he apparently saw none of the irony in having a conversation about air quality while he was puffing on the stogie in the cigar tent. I just thought, really, this is what an extraordinary way to do business. In fairness to him, though, because he didn't come out of government, he didn't think he knew everything. And his team was very accessible to me, and apparently not that many of my colleagues took him up on the opportunity, but my view was, I'm going to go down there, I'm going to tell them what I'm doing, particularly if I was working on bills that weren't particularly ideological or partisan. They were open. If I got a veto, I would go back down again and say, hey, you vetoed my really good bill, how come? They would usually tell me, and I would come back the following year and could frequently get a signature after we tweaked the bill. So I would fault the governor Governor Schwarzenegger in two ways. One is, I think he thought there were 4 branches of government instead of 3. executive, legislative, judicial, and the governor's office. And it was like, no, Governor, actually, you're supposed to be responsible for that executive branch. You know, I know you want to talk about blowing up the boxes, but how about you actually, you know, accept some responsibility for making this administration work better? That was a little bit of a source of tension. I also think that he never really confronted our fundamentally imbalanced budget during the 7 years. I think he hoped that somehow the economy would grow and we could just luck out of it. Governor Brown, a very different guy. Stop and think about the fact that he has previously been governor, attorney general, secretary of state, a community college trustee, a big city mayor, the chair of the California Democratic Party, a candidate for the United States Senate, and a candidate for President of the United States. There's not an awful lot of government that he hasn't been involved in on a first-hand basis. I want to say this as artfully as I can. There's not a lot of government about which he doesn't have a strongly held opinion. So the struggle sometimes is to say, Governor, it might be different than your experience was at this particular time in this particular place, because he does have very strongly held, well-formed opinions. I think that's a bit of a struggle. I would credit him with being almost laser-like in his focus on the fiscal stability of the state. That has been his priority from day one. I think it is an appropriate priority given the roller coaster ride we have been on. But I would say I think he was perhaps a little naive about how easily he could pull Democrats and Republicans together. Last year, some of you will recall, he thought he was going to be able to get an agreement by March so we could have a ballot measure on the June ballot. And there were a number of us, myself included, who said, Governor, you know, that may prove a little more challenging than you anticipate. How about a plan B? Maybe you should be thinking about an initiative measure. Oh, no, 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 no. And he just sort of, I think, recalled from a day gone by the ability to pull people together and didn't fully appreciate how much more challenging the current. Then he thought he could get it done by June. That didn't happen. And now here we are, you know, a year and a half later. The governor, I think, thought that if he had a ballot measure, everybody would say, okay, we're going to go with you. And then he discovered that other people could have ballot measures. So I think he gets credit for his focus on fiscal stability being job one. I think he has perhaps been a little bit naive about just what a challenge that will be, and I think we have struggled as a result. That's some thoughts from the last several years.
If I could just add just a couple of things that I think highlight the distinction. One is if you were to go into Arnold Schwarzenegger's office for a meeting, he had a boardroom table that was massive with huge high back chairs behind it that you could hardly move and lift. And I think his sword from Conan the Barbarian was on the table behind in a glass case. So that was his presence when you would go to a meeting in his office. Now, Governor Brown's office, you walk in and it looks like a picnic table. It's a long wooden table with benches along the side of it that you sit on one side and he'll sit on the other side.
I was going to say it looks like a picnic table because it is a picnic
table. That's
why
right.
It looks like a picnic table.
And I mean, there's a real distinction. I mean, that kind of tells you the kind of person. And then just an example, I was very fortunate to be able to bring a company from Baltimore, Maryland, their headquarters to Belmont, Sun Edison. And we did some legislation that we needed to do, and there was the kind of the grand opening, or when they were doing it, and the governor came for that opening. And this was the day after he vetoed or signed legislation when the deadline was for him to do that. So he sees me as he comes down the stairs and he's over. We read each other. He said, "Well, how did I do on your bills?" And I said, "Well, you vetoed one that was a little upsetting to me," and I can't. He said, "Well, which one was that?" And so I have a hard time remembering the numbers of my bills. So I said, "What was the one about this?" And she said, "Oh, yeah, I remember that." And he went into a long dissertation as to why he vetoed that bill. Knew it, understood it, and had a reason. And I said, I can understand how you could be in that place with this. And it made sense. And that would never happen with Arnold Schwarzenegger. When he would veto the bills, a lot of times he just vetoed them. And if you remember that legislative year, he just vetoed them because he ran out of time and didn't want to deal with them, saying that there were too many laws or too many bills that needed to be addressed. But this governor is very thoughtful, and I think does an outstanding job in what he's doing.
But I want to go back and give Governor Schwarzenegger his due on the vetoes, because I was at an event in our district a breakfast event, bumped into the governor, Governor Schwarzenegger, and it was at the end of the year, and he said, "Oh, all I'm doing is signing these Simitian bills." And I immediately, of course, said, "Not all of them, Governor." And he immediately said, "But I know you. You'll do them again and bring them back next year better, and you'll make me sign them then." And I thought, interesting that a guy who was a little remote, frankly, in terms of his, sort of movie star persona, actually understood an individual member's work pattern well enough to make that assessment. That surprised me, frankly. I thought, I would not have thought he would have noticed that that was my MO over the time that I was working with the Schwarzenegger administration. So,
Rich Gordon, have you worked with both?
No, my experience as a freshman, that's what they call us when we're our first term in the legislature, has been just with Governor Brown. And two quick thoughts. One was that there was some conversation a moment ago about the governor having had experience at many levels of government and previous experience. In a meeting yesterday that I was in with the governor and the U.S. Transportation Secretary, the governor commented about, he said, at one point, we were able to fix our roads, he said, because we raised the gas tax. He said, when I was governor, we did that. And the U.S. Transportation Secretary looked at him and said, but you're governor now. And so I hope he remembers that. The other thing that I've come to kind of the way I look at Jerry Brown, my background is that I have a master's in divinity. I served as a Methodist minister for 5 years before moving into social work and eventually public service. Jerry Brown has a background in training in theology, went to Jesuit seminary. What I know of my friends in the Jesuits is that they have a strong passion for thought, discipline, and commitment, and sometimes a little rigidity. And I'm also aware that Governor Brown spent a fair amount of time when he was younger in India and exploring alternative religions. And so I find it very helpful to understand him by looking at the Facebook page of his dog. The dog Sutter has a Facebook page, and under the category of religion, Sutter claims that he is a Zen Jesuit. That has helped me to understand Jerry Brown.
We're going to go ahead and we just have a few more minutes, but we're going to take some questions from the audience here. I'm not going to get through all of them, but and we don't necessarily have to everyone answer on it, but keep these a little short and the lightning round. As I mentioned, we have a lot of people here from the school districts, and they do have a concern. The proposed weighted students funding formula for K-12 public schools is very harmful to our local school district. What is your view on the government's proposal? Anyone?
I know we had a meeting yesterday of our budget subcommittee chairs in the assembly, and our approach is going to be to not include that in the budget. We see it as a policy discussion, and that ought to be kicked over and talked in the policy committee. It's not something that we want to immediately adopt.
To take a quick step back, and I'll try and do this quickly, no one would say that the system we have in place is a good system. I call it the Winchester Mystery House of public finance. You would never design a finance structure this way. The governor, I give high marks for prompting the discussion about, can't we find a system that is simplified and that has transparency, fairness, and adequate funding for schools. I give low marks for the way in which it has been rolled out. I think it has been ham-handed at best, frankly. And I think the Senate is in much the same place that Rich has described the Assembly, which is the notion of a weighted student formula, which is shorthand for a simplified funding mechanism, may well deserve discussion and action, but trying to do it on a hurry-up basis in the first 4 months of this year for the coming year was sort of, I think, ill-fated from the start.
Another question. This is a concern from a senior in the audience, and why there's no mention that the very wealthy will include all the seniors that sell their homes, putting them into that wealthy tax bracket. This is money they're using and they're selling their homes to generate income to live on. Is there any provision to address that issue for seniors selling their homes and not getting put into that higher tax bracket?
I guess I'm not clear. I don't believe they would be put into it's an income basis, not a capital gains basis for the tax formula that the governor is proposing. So it.
So there's your answer, right?
That's my
Yeah,
assumption
so
as to what the law.
it's a capital gains issue.
That's
Right.
capital gains, not
Income,
not income,
tax.
but it may fit
which will
into
either be
that.
short-term, long-term capital gains, which will put you on approximately, if I would say, about 15%. Right, okay. Another
I
question.
don't think it-
As you know, there will be significant cuts to child care funding in order to solve the budget deficit. Many parents across the state are concerned they will lose these funds and will be unable to provide for their families. Are there any solutions you see to prevent cuts to child care? And if there are cuts to child care?
I think there will be cuts to childcare in some form or fashion. We've seen them over the years. It's an area that I've been working on since my first days in the legislature. Particularly in the welfare to work arena, it's incredibly counterproductive because we're trying to encourage people to move from welfare to work. One of the critical ingredients in their ability to move from welfare to work is access to affordable child care. You take away the child care, and then rather obviously the responsibility to tend to the kids during the day is going to get in the way of people's ability to make the transition into the workforce. But absent the additional revenues, that's going to happen. The problem is aggravated this year by the fact that the governor is proposing as well to eliminate something called transitional kindergarten, which we are rolling out in the September of this year. This is a piece of legislation I worked on 2 years ago that starts kids in kindergarten when they're a little older, like the rest of the country, but takes the savings from that and reinvests it in those same kids being able to get a year of something called transitional kindergarten before they start kindergarten. The governor has said, you know what, I want to take the savings, but I don't want to reinvest it, which is another sort of polite way of saying I want to exclude about 125,000 kids a year from kindergarten. If those 125,000 kids can't go to public school and we're cutting child care at the same time, it's a double hit on families. So we have been pushing back on this attempt to deny access to K through 12. It would be the largest disenfranchisement of students from a public school system in the nation's history if it were allowed to go forward.
I think in the child care issue that Joe mentioned, the Assembly Budget Committee has rejected the $500 million child care cut, and but I think, I agree with Joe, there will be some portion of that in the budget as it moves forward.
Good. Okay. How much of the budget can the legislature actually control? It seems as if a large portion is off limits due to initiative mandates. And why are we always attacking education and not public employees and their pension? Is this true? And you have a comment on that?
I still remember the woman who came up to me at a town hall and said, I want you to balance the budget, but I don't want to see any cuts to education, health, and welfare. And I said, well, ma'am, that's going to be a challenge because 80% of the budget is in those areas. K through 12 is about 40%. That's a function of the fact that after Prop 13, those local property tax revenues went down and the state had to step in and fill the gap. And it has been that way now for more than 30 years. So one of the reasons that education takes the hit is because it is 40% probably K through 12, another 10% for higher education. Half the state budget is in fact education, higher and K through 12, and that means education's always going to be in the line of fire when the state has a bad year. It's just that simple. And the other piece of the question about pensions, we've talked about pension reform, and I think I'll just let that go in light of the hour.
Good. You've all been in government for decades. How did pension reform get out of control to begin with?
I'm going to be opinionated and grab the microphone again because I don't see my two colleagues jumping at this question anyway. We had a fascinating conversation at one of the conference committee hearings we had where somebody from the League of California Cities, local government, explained what he hoped we would do in terms of limiting various pension entitlements at the local level. And this was a startling development to me because as someone who'd been in local government, as the question suggests, I said, just hang on a second, sir, I want to make sure I'm hearing this right. The League of California Cities is saying, please protect us from ourselves. You want the state to put rules in place that would limit the ability of locally elected city council members to negotiate pensions through the collective bargaining process. And much to my surprise, he said, yes, Senator, that's what I'm telling you, because we're in a place where what happens in the Bay Area, for example, with 100 different jurisdictions, is if 1 or 2 or 3 cities put something in the contract, it then becomes very difficult for this city council or the one down the road to say no. And so it is always a race to the top in terms of benefits over time. And so we heard that if the state put some boundaries, if you will, and said, you'll negotiate your own contracts, but do that within the context of these limits, that might be helpful. And I do think that's part of the problem. Assemblymember Hill mentioned earlier, we also, I think, are suffering today for the euphoria of the late 90s when everybody thought that there was only growth, that the world would always be richer and more prosperous with every passing year. I'm not an economist, but I know they're called business cycles for a reason, because there are business cycles, and I think that was part of the contributing factor as well.
Anyone else? There you go. What's the state doing and what's happening behind closed doors to help the housing crisis? You know, the banks, the short sales, foreclosures, etc. Is that something that's being done on a state level, or is this a federal issue?
Well, there's, first of all, the Attorney General has reached some agreement with the large banks on particularly the foreclosure issue. There's a host of legislation, many bills introduced on this topic. I think earlier you heard Senator Simitian talking about why we do conference committees rather than have different discussions about different pieces of legislation, bring them all into one place. So a conference committee has been established on the foreclosure issue and mortgage protections. The committee has just been identified and will start meeting. They're going to look at the host of bills with a goal of trying to craft something that has some agreement among the many parties and provides an appropriate level of protection, both for the banking industry, but more importantly for the individual homeowner who may be facing foreclosure.
Anyone else? Good. The state of California and the federal government have conflicting laws regarding medical marijuana. Is there anything the state can do to encourage the federal government to better respect California's state laws?
Joe and I have answered the last two questions.
I think you're good for the next two as well. This one, you're doing a great job so far. I think it's wonderful. Well, I think that we've gotten mixed messages from Washington on this subject. As you know, California has established medical marijuana through initiative program that had been working. Some people would say it would be working successfully. Others would say that it's being abused in many ways throughout the state. Probably the truth is somewhere in between. The federal government, as you know, when President Obama was elected, if I remember correctly, he said that the federal government would kind of look the other way as long as there weren't abuses and it was used for legitimate medical purposes. And I think people relied on that. Now, that may have been to some of those who were not legitimate to feel that they had now a free license to move forward and commercialize and recreational use of the recreational use of marijuana, and then abuse this opinion that the president made. But we do know that of late there has been that mixed message where the federal government has come and raided and through the marshals and and law enforcement and the U.S. Attorney's Office to make numerous arrests and confiscation of property for the illegal use and sale of marijuana, even though it is for the legitimate California use for medicinal purposes. And as we know, the federal government has not recognized the use of marijuana for any use other than it being a controlled substance. So that's the dilemma, and I think we haven't received clarity from the federal government as of yet, and hopefully we do.
Well, I'd like to thank this panel, and not just for being here today and taking time from Sacramento. It's very tough for them to get back here. Usually they have a Friday free and maybe 1 week every year free to come down this way. But I also want to thank all of them and all of our lawmakers and legislatures for the hard work they do in Sacramento. So often they have to make decisions where there is no good decision, or both decisions are equally as damaging or equally as beneficial to the people. So thank you so much for being here, and thank you so much for all the devotion you've given, your lifetime devotion from all of you for serving the communities in San Mateo, the state, and Santa Clara County. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I'm around all weekend. Okay, Don, thanks.
Good, thanks for coming.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and I thought it was an odd visit because there's no reason why we have to take action. I mean, I understand everybody wants us to move sooner rather than later, but it's and the reporters were all a little perplexed once I started getting phone calls. They're like, well, but don't you? I said, no. Basically, the argument is we'd like you to move sooner rather than later. So if you say no, we could give your money to somebody else. But